That's my name in English. But actually, I'm a Chinese. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and so I have a Chinese name. I don't know how many of you understand Chinese, but here it is. I was born and raised in Hong Kong and was baptized a Catholic, somewhat different from the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church. And when I was baptized, they gave me a Christian name. And this is the name I have been using for most of my life. And it's Joseph. All right? Because I have been, well, I was educated in Hong Kong up to 18 years old, and I went to the States, the US, to get my undergraduate and later graduate degrees. And then I taught in the United States for a number of years. And while there, you know, it's a country where relationships are very casual. And my students just called me Joseph. You can do the same, right? It feels better. I mean, I feel better. Now, we're going to have about 10 hours of time, classroom time, maybe a little bit more, 15 hours of classroom time together. And I want you to feel relaxed, okay? Relaxed. I'm going to use the traditional lecture approach, but any one of you who want to talk about something, raise a question, or to point out some of my mistakes, okay? Raise your hand, right? No problem. But when you talk, speak out loud, because I'm a little bit hard of hearing. Getting old and not very good, right? So especially for those sitting in the back. Actually, you know, I like my students to sit way up front so that I can interact with them. You know, I can look into their eyes and see whether they're understanding me or whether I'm doing a good job trying to make them understand me, right? So next time, come up to the front. Now, one thing. At the end, or almost at the end of the 5 weeks of, 5 lectures. At the end of the 5 lectures, you're supposed to hand in a small assignment, a very short one, okay, which you can do by going online to do a little bit of research, either regarding demography, which is population studies, or China studies. Relationship or anything that has to do with China. These are the 2 main components of my lectures. Actually, I thought, before I came here, I thought that the demography was going to be the mainstay. But after I came here talking with Professor Lukin, he seems to want me to do somewhat more about China. I think but because I have already prepared the lectures, it'd be perhaps half-half, right? And I will begin by talking about demography. We'll spend about maybe 7-8 hours talking about demography in class, and then we'll spend the rest of the time talking about China, right? History, the problems, and the future, as well as the diplomatic relationship of China with other countries, right? Getting a bit hot. I know you're students in the School of International Studies and not in the School of Economics and Business. But let me tell you, because the economic situation in Russia is developing so quickly that there will be a lot of demand for people with some business knowledge, even though they may not be business graduates. But if you know some business, or have some ideas about what business is about, this is going to help in your future. even though you may not be working in the business sector per se. Let's say, suppose you go and work in the government, okay? But if you know a little bit of business, it will help your job. Okay? So in my lectures on demography, I'm going to start it by using an example in business, right? It has to do with the business of marketing, selling your products in a different country. I'm going to talk about the experience of a very famous company selling a very famous product. It's the Honda Motors company. You know it, right? Honda is a very popular brand. And I'm going to talk about its experience in the United States in the early 60s throughout the 90s, right? So when people talk about Honda, what do they think about? A car, right? But essentially, Honda did not start as a car-making company. It first started as a company that produced motorcycles, right? Motorcycles. The company went into the United States in the year 1959. Okay, they set up a small subsidiary there. In other words, you have the parent company in Japan and a child company, okay, an offspring, a subsidiary. That's what we call it in English, subsidiary. It started a subsidiary in the state of California with only 3 persons, small outfit, okay? And then it introduced its first motorcycle, into the United States in the year 1960. Okay, so this is a here. So first motorcycle sold in the Honda motorcycle sold in the U.S. 1960. In 1962, the sales began to move up very quickly. Okay, and by the 70s, Honda Motorcycles was the single most successful motorcycle company in the U.S. Right? The products it introduced were, well, quite small motorcycles, very sporty, and young people loved them, right? However, by the 1980s, sales went down. And the company was very puzzled. Hey, we have a good brand, we have built up a good reputation, and our distribution network is very good, and we beat our opponents. How come we're losing business? We have sales going down quickly. So that was in the 80s. By 1990, it hit a wall. Like that. Sales were almost dried up. So that was 1990. So it was going up. You know, it first started here, it was going up, and flat, and then going down, like that. Right? So at first it tried to lower its prices and try to sell more, but it didn't work. Even if they lowered the prices, no one came to buy, right? And so it was very puzzled. Eventually, it asked some consultants, business consultants, to find out the reason why. And lo and behold, the answer was in demography. It was a demographic issue, right? Now, to understand that, we need to go into a little bit of demographic analysis. The first concept we introduce is the concept of cohort analysis. Cohort. Cohort is a special term in demography, meaning people born more or less during the same period of time, right? So one cohort may be born before the war, let's say. Another cohort will be maybe born immediately after the war. You know, they belong to different cohorts. That's the way we use that term, all right? Now, in the US, and maybe probably in the West in general, demographers have distinguished several cohorts, beginning with the so-called lost generation. Lost generation. Those were born in the early 1880s to around 1900s. Right? Lost generation. Well, how come they have this name, lost generation? Well, this generation, when they were growing up, it was the First World War. Okay? They grew up during the First World War period. That's when they were about 15, 20, 25 years old. Okay? And because the First World War, as you know some history, which I'm sure you do, it was a completely meaningless war, very destructive. A lot of people died for no good reason. At the end of the war, everybody thought that was stupid. Well, except for some ultra-nationalists here and there. And so that generation lost a lot. And they were called the lost generation, right? And then the second generation, the second cohort, was the was still called the greatest generation. These were born in the early 90s to the 1920s. Okay? Quite the opposite, right? Well, again, that has to do with the period that they were growing up. Okay. These people grew up and fought the Second World War when they were about 20 years old. And the Second World War was considered by almost every country that won the war to be a worthwhile war. A war against injustice, against the Nazis, against the Japanese aggressors, right? And moreover, they won the war. And after winning the war, these soldiers went back to their own countries and built up their economies. Whether they lost the war or whether they won the war. They went back home and built up their economies. The Americans went back home and built themselves up into a superpower. The Japanese soldiers went home and then also built up a very strong economy, right? So did the Germans. So this generation did something worthwhile. And later, historians called that generation the greatest generation, right? The one that follows is called the silent generation. Sometimes they're called the lucky few. They were very quiet. They were born early 90s and until the 1945, right? Why were they very quiet? You see, when they were kids, America especially, and also most of the Western world, went into a big economic depression, right? That happened in the year 1929. But even the years before 1929, it was not very well. The world economy was not very good, right? And that Great Depression lasted almost until the beginning of the Second World War. So they grew up very poor. They grew up very poor. But they were born too late for the First World War, and they were not old enough to join in the Second World War. So they did not have to fight and die. So they were lucky, right? They were also lucky because of another thing. This generation is smaller in terms of numbers. And the reasons are very obvious. You know, during those years, during those decades, their parents fought wars, their grandparents fought wars, and they suffered a big you disaster. So, you know, when people are dying, when people are poor, they don't want to give rise they don't want to give birth to too many babies, right? It's costly to feed a baby, right? So there were fewer babies. Now, if you have fewer babies, then when these children grew up, they would have a better time entering universities, right? Because, you know, the professors are there, the universities have been built, and suddenly, you know, there are fewer people entering the university, and they have a better chance of getting into the universities, right? And getting education in general. So these people grew up poor, but they were lucky. They did not lose their lives, not too many of them, fighting wars, and they had better opportunities, okay, when they grew up. So this was the silent generation. Now, but what I really want to focus on is the next one. They're baby boomers. These were born in the Western world, at least, from 1946 to around 1964. Right? The numbers are a little bit different between different scholars, but generally that's a space of 18 years. Now this is a very important generation. I belong to this generation. I was born in 1951, right? This is a big generation. In terms of numbers, this is huge. Especially compared with the silent generation, which was small, this one is huge. Why was it huge? Well, because the war ended, and the soldiers went home and they reunited with their spouses, and they had babies. A lot of them, right? So in peacetime, after war, you usually see a sudden increase in the population growth rate. And so this baby boomers generation happened in almost all of the countries who fought the Second World War, including the countries that lost the war, including Japan. In the US, the size of this generation is about 75 million. Some say it's 78, some say it's 75, that's somewhere in between, right? Now, at that point, in 1964, around that point, America had a population of a little bit less than 200 million. Right, a little bit less than 200 million. And you see, 75 of them were baby boomers of various age, okay, of various ages. So this was a very important generation. Now there were 5, 6, and 7. But those generations coming afterwards, they don't have fancy names. This one is called a Generation X. They ran out of interesting names, they just called them Generation X. And this Generation Y, this Generation Z. I wonder what would the name for the next generation be after they run out of the alphabet. Anyway, so that was different cohorts. Now, one thing, I've been teaching in the West. I've been teaching in the U.S. And it's mostly in the U.S. and then later in Hong Kong and Japan. So I know some demography of the West, and also some Asian, Southeast Asian countries. But I don't know much about the demography of Russia, right? So you will excuse me if I say something stupid about the population scene of Russia, and you can correct me, right? Now, so what I'm talking about is the cohort analysis, typical cohort analysis of the West, and including some Southeast Asian countries, right? Now let's look at this picture. I say that the baby boomers is the very important phenomenon in explaining Honda's fortune in the U.S. during the first 30 years or so of its operation in that country, right? Now, the demographers told the management of the Honda company in the U.S., and they told them something like this. Well, you know what? In this country, what kind of people buy motorcycles? Mostly young people. And when do they start buying motorcycles? They say it's about age 16. They did some studies and found that most of the young people that bought motorcycles or wanted to buy motorcycles were about 16 years old. The reason? They graduate from junior high school around that age. Okay? Now, after they graduate from junior high school, many of them go out to work and not continuing with education, right? Many of them just go out to work and get a job. And once they get a job, they have the money. And they will set aside some money, maybe save up some money for a year or two, and then use that money to pay for the down payment, the first lump sum payment on a motorcycle. That's when they start buying, right? Now, so if you add 1946, the first year of the baby boomers, add to that 16, that's the age when the first baby boomers are old enough and have enough money to buy a motorcycle. Okay? So that's 1962. This is the reason why sales went up in 1962, right? And so these baby boomers continued to enter the market as they were born and reached age 16. More and more of them, right? However, you know, the baby boom has an upswing stage and then reaches a peak and then go downhill, right? This is the population growth rate, right? So, by the late 50s and early 60s, the last of the baby boomers were being born, okay? And when the last of them were born in 1964, they bought motorcycles. But afterwards, afterwards, they started to change their behavior. Now, the second thing that the demographers told Honda was, you know, at what age, do you know at what age would these young people quit buying motorcycles, in fact, selling them?
18.
Yes, when they get married. And that's about 26 years old on the average. For Americans, for American young people, when they get it on the average, when they reach 26 years old, they get married, right? Now, when they get married, what do?
Buy a car.
Well, they have to listen to their wives, right? And the wives usually want to have a baby. And they want security, right? As girlfriends, they enjoy riding on the back of a motorcycle, right? Very, very funny, very exciting. But when they get married, the woman, the mother, is the first to say to tell the man, the husband, quit riding the motorcycle, right? In fact, they might have been saying that, you know, just before they're getting married. Sell the motorcycle. What for? They get a wedding ring. Right? So typically that was the story. Around 25, 26, these people traded in their motorcycles. Used the money to buy a wedding ring and get married. Okay? So there's a life cycle for people. There's also a life cycle for the motorcycle product. Right? Now, you do a little bit of arithmetic. 1964. That was the last year that the baby boomers were born, right? So 1964, add to that 26 years, when the last of the baby boomers reach marrying age, when you add it up, 1990. This part of the story. All right? Well, so Honda learned the lesson that if you want to sell a product, you have to look at this life cycle of the product. And if you want to understand the life cycle of the product, you have to understand the life cycle of the people, especially demographic cycles, the cohort analysis. Right? Later on, Honda learned the lesson and introduced products to suit these cohort analysis. For instance, in 1973, in 1973, it introduced the first Honda Civic. Now that's a small car, right? It's a small car. And, you know, they planned it so that, you know, when they trade in the motorcycles, and after a few years, when they save up enough money, they buy a small car. And that's a small car that fits a small family, right? Very, very economical to run, very small, but a nice one, right? So, again, it was a very, very successful product. Okay. And then around the year 1980, I think it was 87. 86. The year 1986, they introduced, this time a big car, and a very expensive car, the Lexus. Okay. Now, why did they choose in 1986 to introduce Lexus into America? You can do a little bit of arithmetic. 1946, 1986. Okay? So this is what? 40. So when these first baby boomers reach the age of 40, what have they become? They have become successful managers. They've become full professors. They have become probably the successful owner of a business. In the US, they have a term for it, yuppies. They have become the yuppies, Y-U-P-P-I-E-S, up and coming young professionals, something like that. Right? So when the first of these baby boomers reached middle age, many of them became quite successful. Okay? And they were ready to buy upscale cars like Lexus, so we introduced Lexus. Okay? And after those two introductions, Honda became one of the most successful car producers in the US. Now, of course, it did not give up its motorcycle business, okay? But it has to change course. Rather than selling to a shrinking youth group, Honda switched position and tried to sell to a much older group. Okay? So in 1974, it introduced a motorcycle called the Gold Wing. Now, what is the Gold Wing? What does it look like? It's not a small, sporty bike, but it's a cruiser, very heavy, okay? And the style of riding is different. When you're a young person, you want to ride on a fast motorcycle, right? You do this, you know. But when you're older, you cannot ride it like this. Why? Because you have a bulge here, right? You cannot ride like that. It's uncomfortable. So what you do is you ride like this. And that's what a cruiser is like. You know, it's like this. You know, sitting upright, even a little bit backwards. So Gold Wing is such a cruiser. And it became very, very successful. Right? So, now, that is my brief introduction to demography. It doesn't look like demography. It looks more like a topic for business students, right? And I think the lesson is, in business, as well as in many other areas of studies, demography is an important consideration. You cannot afford not to have demographic analysis in your mind when you go through those important issues. Here's one, right? So, let me say something more about another cohort here. Here, this one. Generation Y, right? This is also important. This is also important. This is the generation that was born around the year you see, this is the period. This is the period immediately before and after the year 2000, which is sometimes called the millennium year, right? Millennium year. So this generation is also called, Generation Y is also called the millennials. the millennials. Now, this generation happens to be quite big as well. In fact, it is almost as big as the baby boomers. Okay, about 75. Well, this is people say that it's from 68 to 75, and it's 75 to 78. A little bit smaller, but almost just as big. Okay. Now, people might ask the question: why would the millennials be a big generation, bigger than the Generation X, almost as big as the boomers? This was small. So you see a pattern: small, big, right? And you also see that each generation is about 20 years. Each generation is about 20 years. Okay. Now, why is it the fact that each generation is about 20 years? Well, it has to do with the age at which women give birth to daughters. So in demography, the length of a generation is defined to be the time difference, the number of years between a mother giving rise to her first daughter to the year in which the daughter in turn gives rise to another son or daughter, right? So that's the average length of time. And for the period that we're talking about in the West, it's about 20 years, right? So that's the length of a generation as defined in demography. It turns out to be 20 years. Now, the baby boomers generation was big. And you know, children, when they grow up, most of them are somewhat rebellious, right? Especially against their parents. When their parents tell them to do A, they do B. When the parents tell them to do B, they do A, right? They tend to rebel against their parents when they were kids growing up, young adolescents. But after they get married, and especially when they're having children, then the opposite thing occurs. They would then become a little bit more conservative, more traditional. In fact, they very often would behave like their parents, right? Especially in child rearing. You know, in school you learn about different things. You don't learn about how to rear a child, how to feed a baby, how to change the nappers, right? All those things, when a person gives birth to a baby, when a mother gives birth to a baby, she scratches her head, hey, how am I going to do this? Well, then she recalls, how did my mother do it? How did I observe my mother do it to my brothers and sisters? That's the way she would do it to her children, right? So on matters of child rearing, people learn from their parents. Also on the matter of child rearing, the number of children that they want to have is in part influenced by their own experience. You know, when these millennials were growing up, they were actually, you see, they were the children of the baby boomer generation. They were not the children of the Generation X, right? Generation Z are the children of Generation X. The millennials of Generation Y are the children of the baby boomers, mostly. So my son would belong to the millennials. Now, when these millennial young people were growing up as kids, they had lots of brothers and sisters, right? And they remember that it was fun growing up with number of brothers and sisters. So they also in turn wanted to have a higher number, big number of babies, right? So if you look at the number of babies that this generation had per family, it was very, very, very high. On the average, in the US, the figure is about 3.5. Okay. Now this generation had much lower average number of children, about 1 point something, right? This generation, although not having quite as big families as the parents, had about 2 point something, right? So this generation is very big, in part because it was an influence of their parents' generation. For this reason, this generation is also called the echo generation. Echo. You know the word echo? Okay. Now, what's good about an echo generation? That's big. And what's good about a big generation? Well, a big generation is good for business, right? You know demand, right? Demand, market demand. How many of you have studied first course in economics? No? Well, if none of you have studied economics, just use your common sense, right? If you have more people, there will be greater demand for products, right? And producers will have a happier time because there will be more customers. Simple, right? So, for the millennials, because they have a bigger number, okay? Bigger number. When they grow up, especially when they reach the age of buying a home, the real estate market is going to be very good, right? Now, right now, in the several years in the past, in the last several years, the real estate market in the West, way down, right? Because of the financial crisis. It crashed in the US. It crashed in Europe. It also crashed in Japan. Now, some people are saying, the millennials are growing up. Probably they will help restore the real estate market in those countries to better health. Okay? Now let's again do some arithmetic. Now let's say 1980s, the millennials were born from the early 80s to 2005. Now for this early 80s bunch, let's say, at what age do people in the West buy houses? 30, 35, about that age. You know, it's first thing they buy is a car. First major purchase is a car after their marriage. The second thing they want to buy is a home. Okay? When they get married, it's 26, 27, they buy a car. Okay? Then maybe 5 to 10 years afterwards, they've saved up enough money to pay for the down payment for a home. And then they buy a home, right? So again, we do some arithmetic. Let's say 1980, 85, maybe 86. Now it's year 2013. About there. These people have just gotten married, probably in a few years' time. They're saving up money. In a few years' time, they will be buying. Right? In fact, the real estate market in the US is showing some revival. maybe that is due to the business cycle, down cycle going up naturally afterwards. But part of it is probably because of some of the millennials are already entering the market. Early millennials are already entering the market, right? So they say, well, perhaps this is going to help in the real estate market. Now we'll see, okay, we'll see. A few things about the millennials. And also the baby boomers. Now, wait a minute. How much time do I still have for this session? Now it's 1 o'clock, right? It's about 1 o'clock. So I still have about 15 minutes. Now, in the US, the baby boomers, the period of their birth lasted about 18 years, from 46 to 64. That is not the case with another country which had a baby boom. That was not the case with Japan, right? Now for Japan, it also started in the year 46, but it ended much quicker. The reason was government intervention. After the war, Japanese soldiers went home, and peace was restored, and the families started to produce babies. And so the baby boom happened in Japan in 46. But Japan was the country that lost the war, right? It suffered 2 atomic bombs. And most of the country was devastated. Devastated, a very poor country at the end of the war, right? But the babies kept coming, right? And so the Japanese government very soon became frightened. Hey, we cannot afford to have that many babies. We don't have enough schools. The schools have all been bombed down, and we have to rebuild the schools. We don't have hospitals. We don't have enough farmers. A lot of the farmers were drafted to join the war, and they were killed. And so the production was very tight. What should we do? Well, starting in the year 1949, the Japanese government introduced very, very strict regulations on women giving birth. Okay? And it was the government trying to stop the women from giving birth to too many children. Right? So very quickly after at the end of the Second World War, the baby boom in Japan disappeared, stopped. All right? Stopped. So Japan had a very sudden spurt of high growth rate immediately after the war, and then a very sudden drop in the number of babies born after the year 1950. Now, later on, we will see that that was one of the reasons why, among the developed countries of the world, Japan was the first one to encounter what is called the aging problem. Okay? The aging problem. Not having enough young people to sustain the economic activities. That was the reason why. Okay, or one of the major reason why. Right? So that's one thing to notice. The baby boom ended in Japan too early, or very early, and that has led to the current severe aging problem in Japan. That's one thing to know. Well, Japan also has an echo generation. Okay, also has an echo generation, but it's not quite as large, for the same reason that I've just mentioned. And you know, the real estate market in Japan is also way down. It has been down for about 20 years. And after the recent financial crisis, it went down further. Okay. let me tell you something about the home prices in the province or prefecture that I live in Japan now. It's called Akita. Akita is, Japan. It consists of one island, another island here, another island there. 4 islands, right? Honshu is the major island. My city is here. Tokyo is here. And so we're in the north. Rural area, agricultural, fisheries. A lot of the young people don't like living in the countryside, so most of them go to Tokyo when they grew up and after graduation from universities. So real estate prices in Akita and elsewhere in Japan, maybe in Kyushu as well, are way down. It's so cheap. Recently one of my colleagues wanted to buy a home, and she bought a home for the amount of money that she could only buy a parking space in Hong Kong. With the same amount of money, she can afford a parking space in Hong Kong. But in Akita, she can buy a house, a 2-story house with a garden and 3 garages. That's how bad it is in Japan, right? But people are again hoping that the echo generation in Japan will come to the rescue. Hopefully, these people, when they grow up and to be about around 30 years old or 35, that they will buy their first homes, right? We'll see whether that happens. Now, another thing we can say about the baby boomers is China. Now, China was one of the participants in the Second World War, and fortunately, it was on the winning side, but at very huge costs. Okay, America was on the winning side, but America did not suffer any loss on its own territories, because America was on a different continent, and the war was fought mostly in Europe, Africa, Asia, right, or Southeast Asia. So America was quite safe throughout the war. But China was not like that. A lot of the fighting was done in China, and it was great destruction, right? Furthermore, after the Second World War, fighting did not stop in China, because then because I'm Chinese, China went into a period of civil war. It was fought all over the country, right? The communists defeated the nationalists in the year 1949. So civil war began almost immediately after the end of the Second World War. It began in earnest around the year 1947, and it continued for about 3 years. Right? And in 1949, the communists defeated the nationalists, and civil war was ended. At that point, the baby boomers ought to appear, right? War ended, peace, and there should be a lot of new babies born, but not really. Because very soon after the end of the civil war in China, after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, it again went into a very costly war. And what was that? The Korean War. Okay. The Korean War, which ended finally it ended, or it died down. It never actually ended. It just stopped, right? It died down in the year 1953. It was at that point that the baby boom occurred in China. Okay? So the baby boomers generation came much later in China. Perhaps 7, 8 years, maybe 10 years in China. Right? Now that has important implications for the economic development of China. So that's one thing. The baby boomers generation came in China later than the rest of the Western world in Japan. Secondly, China did not have an echo generation. You see, a big generation will give rise to a big generation 20 years later, right? That was the case in the US, it was the case in Japan, but not the case in China. Why? Well, if anything happens to a reasonable rule, that must be because the government is doing something. You know, we know that Japan started stringent family planning, forcing down the birth rate in the year 1950. Okay. It was somewhat relaxed in the 60s. Okay. And afterwards, these days in Japan, you have the opposite. You have the government trying to encourage people to produce more babies, right? They don't have enough. It's different. Now for China, the story is different. The baby boomers generation in China essentially lasted quite a long time, actually. It began later, it lasted for a much longer while than in Japan. Because during the more than 25 years of the first of the existence of the new Chinese government, which came into being in 1949. For the first 25 or 27 years, okay, China had one supreme leader, the same leader, for 27 years, the same leader. And you know his name. I suppose you know his name. It's very famous, right? His name is Mao Zedong. Mao. For some reason, either because of his Marxist ideology or because of his traditional Chinese background, cultural background, he did not believe in family planning. His idea was, the more babies, the better. That was one of his famous slogans. Okay. The more people you have, the better you can do things. Right? Now, the capitalists, company owners today would agree to that. You know, more babies, more customers, right? But he happened to be a Marxist. But he will also have had that old Chinese farmers mentality. More babies, better. Well, that is a good reason for that. I mean, in traditional agricultural societies, because children can start work very early in rural areas, right? And once they start work, they can be economically productive. And so Chinese farmers traditionally gave birth to a large number of children. And furthermore, that was a good reason for having a larger number of children. Because in the old days, the mortality rate, the rate of dying among babies was very high. If you have 10 children, maybe 4 of them can survive into age 10. Maybe 2 of them can survive into adulthood. And maybe 1 of them can survive into old age. So you need a lot of children. It was quite common for people, for farmers, at least the richer farmers, in those days, in the old days, okay, to have more than 10 children. Okay? So that would guarantee that when they grew old, they would have at least 1 or 2 sons or daughters to take care of them in their old age, right? So there were 2 reasons. Young children can be productive very early in agricultural societies. And secondly, because the mortality rate was high, the more babies you have, the better guarantee for your old age. So those 2 reasons together meant that the Chinese wanted a lot of children. Okay? So Mao wanted a lot of children. But again, actually China had the same problem as Japan after the war. It was poor, schools were destroyed, farmers were killed during the war, soldiers, etc. And because also of carrying out socialist planned economy, the economic growth rate was very, very low. Okay? The economy was just not very productive. So, actually, the family planners in China was conscious of the problem. They wanted to introduce family planning policy, but Mr. Mao was against it. And so what did they do? Well, they waited and waited until Mao died. Okay? So Mao died in 1976. So the new generation of rulers came into power in the year 1970, around 1978, and tried to carry out new economic and social policies. Okay? So reform started in 1978. That was also the year in which China introduced family planning. At first rather mildly, but came the beginning of 1980s. Okay, in the beginning of the 80s decade, family planning became very, very severe, very strict. All families in China were allowed only 1 child. So there was a 1-child policy. From 1980 on, China carried out a strict 1-child policy. What happens if a woman gets pregnant a second time? Very severe. Very severe. I don't want to go into details, the bloody details, but very severe. Okay. You know, there was a conflict of culture. Chinese farmers wanted to have many babies, but the government wanted to have allow them just 1. Okay? So it was a lot of tragedies. Too bad. But let's leave that aside and look at the consequences. Because the strict policy since the 80s has been enforced even today. Even today. But they are now beginning to relax it a little bit in different areas of the country, but not really. Okay? They still have this very strict 1-child policy. Because of that, the offspring of the baby boomers generation were not allowed to have more than 1 baby. And so the echo generation, which normally, I mean this generation in China was small. It was not like in the US and Japan, when the big baby boomers generation induced a bigger generation Y. In China, that did not happen because of the stringent family planning policy, right? Again, that has severe implications on the labor supply today. In China, when you talk to business people, operating in China, when you talk to the government officials, ask them what's the major headache or what's the major worry of in the Chinese economy. They will tell you labor supply. There has been a shortage in labor supply already. Right? We'll talk about that later. Now, we'll take a 10-minute break. Oh no, this is the only lecture today. Next week there will be a day for which we'll have 2 lectures. Right? Okay, so no more today. That's all.